My name is Hannah Reid. I'm 32 years old, and 8 months ago, my husband walked out the door with a duffel bag and didn't look back. He didn't leave a note, he didn't even wake me up to say goodbye. I found out he was gone when I reached for him in the middle of the night and felt cold sheets. We had been married for 9 years. He moved in with someone else 3 weeks later. Her name came up in a text I wasn't supposed to see, and I looked her up the way you always tell yourself you won't. Her family owned Callaway Investments, one of the oldest private equity firms in the Southeast. Old money, the kind that has a Wikipedia page. I wasn't angry at first, I was just confused. Like standing in a grocery store and forgetting what you came in for. Except the grocery store is your entire life, and you've forgotten everything. Then the confusion became panic. Because I had an 8-year-old daughter, Maisie, and our apartment lease was in his name, and most of what was in our joint savings had already been moved. I had $2,400 in my personal checking account, a part time substitute teaching salary, and a daughter who needed new shoes and lunch money, and a mom who wasn't falling apart at the kitchen table every morning before school. I applied for 17 jobs in 2 weeks. Retail, reception, administrative assistant. I heard back from two. Neither panned out. The substitute teaching work dried up in the summer. That's when I saw the listing. Live-in personal care assistant needed for senior resident. Private estate in Dunmore Hills. Competitive salary plus room and board. Discretion required. Dunmore Hills was 40 minutes north of the city, up through the kind of roads lined with stone walls and old oak trees where you had to slow down for deer. I knew the area. I had driven through it once on a Sunday afternoon with my ex-husband years ago when we used to do things like that together. The listing said the patient had been recently diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition affecting mood and behavior. It said most candidates didn't last the first week. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and looked over at Maisie's backpack hanging by the front door. She had decorated it herself with iron-on patches, a sunflower, a little fox, a patch that said "Stay curious" in cursive. I applied that night. Before I go any further, if you're new here, please hit like and subscribe to Heartwave Stories and tell me in the comments where are you watching from. I'd love to know. Now, let me tell you what happened. I want to be clear about something because I know the first question people always ask, what about Maisie? Where was she while all of this was happening? My mother lives 20 minutes from us in Decatur. She's retired, healthy, and she loves that child more than anything on this earth. The moment I explained the situation, the job, the live-in requirement, the salary, she told me to take it. Maisie would stay with her Sunday through Friday, and I'd come home on weekends. It wasn't perfect. It broke my heart a little every Sunday night when I had to drive away. But Maisie was safe, she was loved, she was in school, and my mother kept her routine exactly the same. That's what mattered. 2 days after I applied, I got a call from an attorney named Mr. Aldrich. He represented the family of the estate's owner. He asked me a series of questions that felt more like a background check than an interview, work history references, whether I had ever dealt with volatile or unpredictable individuals. I told him about the years I had spent in a classroom full of third graders. He laughed once, quietly, and said that might actually be the most relevant experience of all. I was hired. The following Monday morning, I packed a bag, kissed Maisie on the top of her head while she was still warm from sleep, and drove north. The house was at the end of a private road, marked only by a small brass number on a stone post. I almost missed it. When the trees cleared and I saw the property for the first time, I stopped the car for a second just to look. It wasn't the biggest house I'd ever seen, but it had that particular quality that old money has, like it had been there forever and never needed to prove anything. Stone exterior, deep set windows, a garden in the front that looked like someone still cared about it. A woman in her mid-40s answered the door before I could ring the bell. She was dressed simply, expensively, hair pulled back, eyes that moved fast, like she was constantly calculating something. "You must be Hannah," she said. I said yes. She introduced herself as the patient's daughter. Her name was Cecilia. She walked me to the house quickly, efficiently, the way someone gives a tour when they want you to feel oriented but not comfortable. She explained her father's condition in the same tone. Factual, distant. He had been experiencing episodes of severe agitation, memory disruptions, moments of paranoia. He had fired or driven away 4 caregivers in the past 3 months. She said this without apology, like she was reading from a report. Why does he keep losing caregivers? I asked. She paused. He's difficult, she said. Moody, suspicious, he throws things sometimes. Has he hurt anyone? Not seriously. She said it a little too quickly. We reached the end of a hallway on the ground floor. She opened a door. Inside, sitting in a chair by the window with a book closed in his lap, was an old man. Late 70s, silver hair, broad shoulders that had probably once filled a door frame. He looked up when we entered, and his expression moved through surprise, irritation, and resignation in about 2 seconds flat. Another one, he said. This is Hannah, Cecilia said. She'll be helping you for a while. I don't need help. You need someone to manage your medication schedule, Dad. I need everyone to leave me alone. He turned back toward the window. Then, after a moment, he glanced at me sideways. How old are you? 32, I said. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. They keep sending younger ones. Think it'll be harder for me to yell at someone young. He picked up his book. It isn't. Cecilia touched my arm and steered me back toward the hallway. Good luck, she said, and I couldn't tell if she meant it. The rest of that first day was exactly what she had described. He refused lunch. He told me to get out of his room 4 times. At one point, he swept a stack of papers off his desk just because I had rearranged them to straighten them. I picked everything up without a word, put it back roughly where it had been, and sat back down in the chair by the door. He stared at me. Why aren't you leaving? He said. Because I'm not done for the day yet, I said. He went back to his book. By evening, I was exhausted in a way that felt almost physical, like someone had pressed on every muscle. A woman named Dottie, who handled the household stuff, showed me to my room on the second floor. It was small but clean, a window that looked out over the back garden, a desk, a dresser, a lamp. I sat on the edge of the bed and called my mother. Maisie was already asleep. I told my mother it was going to be okay. I wasn't entirely sure I believed that yet. I fell asleep before 9 o'clock. At some point around 11, I woke up thirsty and went downstairs to get a glass of water from the kitchen. The house was dark except for a light at the end of the main hallway. I padded down in socks, turned into the kitchen, and then stopped because I heard voices coming from the sitting room across the hall. The door was cracked open. A man's voice. Low, easy, the tone of someone who was comfortable everywhere he went. And then I heard a laugh that I recognized before my brain could even process it. I knew that laugh. I had fallen asleep to that laugh for 9 years. I walked slowly to the doorway. Through the gap, I could see a man standing near the fireplace with a drink in his hand, gesturing at something and talking. He turned his head and the light caught his face, and for a second I felt the room tilt sideways. It was my ex-husband. He looked exactly the same. That was the thing that hit me the hardest. He looked rested and easy and entirely comfortable, like nothing had happened at all. Like the last year of my life. The lawyers, the emptied accounts, the apartment I had to leave, Maisie asking me 3 times if Daddy was coming back. Like none of it had any weight on him at all. I must have made some sound because he turned. For a moment he just looked at me, then a slow smile crossed his face. Well, he said, this is unexpected. I didn't say anything. He tilted his glass slightly. You work here? I'm the new care assistant, I said. He nodded slowly, like he was processing this and finding it amusing. Huh. He took a sip of his drink. So you're taking care of her grandfather. That's when it landed. The woman he had left me for, the one with the family name and the old money. This was her family's house. This was her grandfather. And I had just become his caregiver. My ex-husband walked toward me until he was about 3 feet away. He tilted his head slightly, and his voice dropped just enough that only I could hear it. "That's a tough job," he said. "Old man's not exactly easy to deal with." Then he smiled again, that particular smile that used to mean he was winning something. "Must be nice though. Square means a roof. Beats substitute teaching." I felt my hands tighten at my sides. He stepped past me toward the hallway, glass still in hand. "Don't let him throw anything at you," he said over his shoulder. "And I'd knock before entering rooms if I were you. We're staying in the East Wing this weekend." Then he was gone. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. I filled a glass of water and I drank it slowly, and I looked out the window at the dark garden, and I thought about Maisie's backpack with the iron-on patches. I thought, I cannot leave this job. I thought, I will not let him take this from me too. The next morning I went back to work. The patient, I'll call him Mr. Whitfield, which is how I addressed him, was already awake when I arrived with his breakfast tray. He looked at the food, then at me, then at the food again. "Eggs again," he said. "You can take it up with Dottie," I said. "She runs the kitchen." He made a noise but picked up his fork. That was progress. Over the next week, I learned his patterns the way you learn the layout of a house in the dark. Slowly, by feel, remembering where things are so you stop bumping into them. He hated being hovered over. He hated when people spoke to him like he was fragile. He hated when anyone moved things without asking. He loved the window that faced east, where the light came in strong in the morning. He liked his coffee black and too hot, which made me nervous, but I gave it to him anyway. He had a habit of opening a book and then staring past it, and I learned that was usually when he was working something out in his head, and interrupting that was the fastest way to set him off. By the end of the first week, he had stopped telling me to leave. That was a small thing, but it felt significant. My ex-husband and his girlfriend came and went on weekends. He was careful to keep a distance when she was around, barely acknowledged me. But when she wasn't in the room, he found small ways to remind me of the arrangement. Once, in front of Dottie and one of the other staff, he said loudly that they should be sure to get the good guest towels laundered since they'd had the help using the main hallway bathroom again. Nobody looked at me. They were too well trained for that, but I felt it. I said nothing. I kept working. Something changed at the end of week 2. A Thursday morning, a doctor arrived early. Not the regular doctor who came for the medication reviews, but someone I hadn't seen before. He was with a specialist in neurology according to the appointment card Cecilia had left on the hallway table. They were in with Mr. Whitfield for almost an hour. When they came out, I went in and found him sitting very still in his chair, staring at the floor. That evening he was worse than he had been since my first day, shouting, knocking over his water glass. He threw a book at the wall so hard the spine cracked. I stayed in the room, just out of range, until he ran out of steam. Eventually, he sat back down in his chair and put his face in his hands. Something about that moment, the way his shoulders dropped, the complete exhaustion of it, made my chest hurt. "I'm sorry," he said quietly to the floor. "It's okay," I said. "It isn't." "No," I said, "but it happens. We can clean it up." He didn't say anything for a while. Then, "What do they keep telling you about me, the doctors, my daughter?" "That your condition affects your mood," I said carefully. He lifted his head and looked at me. His eyes, when he wasn't agitated, were very clear. Dark gray, sharp. The kind of eyes that had spent a lifetime watching things. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer honestly." "Okay," I said. "Do I seem crazy to you?" I thought about it. Actually thought about it. Didn't just rush to reassure him. "No," I said. "You seem frustrated and tired and like someone who doesn't like being handled." Something moved across his face. He looked back at the window for a moment. Then he said, almost to himself, "I'm not losing my mind. I know what they think. I know what they're trying to do." I didn't know then what he meant. I thought it was the kind of thing someone might say when their mind is beginning to slip. That particular fear of it, that insistence. I was gentle. I didn't push, but I didn't forget it either. A few days later, something happened that made me rethink everything. I had forgotten my phone charger in the small office room down the hall, the one I used to write up my daily care notes. I went back for it late in the evening after everyone had gone upstairs. The door to the sitting room was open again, and I heard Cecilia's voice, low and precise. I heard my ex husband respond. I should have kept walking, I know that. But something in her tone stopped me, not emotional, not conversational, the tone of someone going over a plan. I stood just outside the doorway and listened. She said the neurologist had confirmed that the dosage adjustments were producing the right results. My ex husband asked what the timeline looked like. She said 3 to 4 more weeks, maybe less, before the behavior patterns would be consistent enough to support a formal assessment. He asked whether her attorney was ready to file. She said yes. The moment the court appointed a guardian, and it would be her, she would have full legal authority over his medical decisions, his financial decisions, everything. The whole portfolio, my ex husband said. All of it, she said. There was a pause. He had a good run, he said, and they both laughed. I walked back to my room very carefully, like the floor might give way. I sat on my bed and I didn't sleep for a very long time. The next morning, I went to Mr. Whitfield's room earlier than usual. He was already awake, sitting by the window, watching the garden. You're early, he said. I wanted to talk to you, I said, before anyone else is up. He looked at me, really looked. I sat down across from him and I said, I need to ask you something. The medications you've been on, the ones from the recent adjustments, do they feel different to you? A long pause. Yes, he said slowly. Different how? He rubbed his jaw. Foggy, off balance in here. He tapped his temple. Like there's interference? Like I'm watching myself from the wrong end. I took a breath. Then I told him what I had overheard. All of it. I didn't soften it or edit it. I told him clearly his daughter and her boyfriend were deliberately managing his medication in a way designed to make him appear mentally incompetent. They were working toward a court-ordered guardianship that would transfer legal control of everything he owned to her. He listened without moving. When I finished, he was very still for a moment. Then he turned to the window. How long have they been doing this? He said. I don't know, I said. His jaw worked. He didn't speak for almost a minute. Then he said, my first wife, his mother built this company with me. From nothing. We used to joke that we'd bury the receipts. He paused. She died 4 years ago. Cecilia was always her favorite. I never said anything about that. I gave that girl everything. His voice didn't break. It just got very quiet. What do you need from me? I said. He turned back and looked at me with those clear gray eyes. Can you get me to a doctor I can trust? Without going through the house? I thought of my own physician back in the city, Dr. Marchetti. I'd been her patient for 6 years. Yes, I said, I can do that. And an attorney. I know someone. I didn't, but I was going to figure that out. He nodded once. Then let's be careful, he said. And let's be smart. What followed was 2 months that I will probably spend the rest of my life trying to explain to people who weren't there. We stopped trusting the medication schedule from the house physician. I contacted Dr. Marchetti, described the symptoms without naming anyone, and she referred me to a pharmacologist who agreed to do an independent assessment. To a contact of Mr. Whitfield's, a retired colleague he trusted completely. We found an attorney in Atlanta who agreed to come to the property under the cover of a maintenance visit. During all of this, the hardest part was what Mr. Whitfield had to do every day. He had to keep pretending. When Cecilia came by, which was 3 or 4 times a week, he had to be the same man she expected to see, agitated, disoriented, declining. He was extraordinary at it. Decades of boardrooms, he told me once with something like dark humor. You learn how to be whatever the room needs you to be. I watched my ex-husband move through those weeks with total confidence. He had started spending more time at the estate. He redecorated one of the sitting rooms without asking. He had started referring to it, casually and in front of staff, as our house. He stopped being careful around me. I was furniture to him, and furniture doesn't register. Once in the kitchen, he said to Sylvia, while I was standing at the counter not 4 feet away, that they should think about what to do with the East Wing once the transition was complete, whether to keep the staff on or start fresh. Fresh, she said, without looking up from her phone. I turned on the faucet and kept washing the mugs. The pharmacologist's report came back in the third week. The dosage of one of the mood regulation medications had been increased by nearly 40% above the therapeutic range. Another medication, one not listed on any of the official care paperwork, had been added. The combination was specifically associated with cognitive disruption, heightened agitation, and memory impairment. The attorney filed a quiet emergency petition with the probate court, the same court that Cecilia had been planning to use against her father. We needed one more thing: the recordings. Mr. Whitfield's study had an old intercom system built into the walls, a relic of the original construction, the kind of thing you find in houses that old. He knew about it. He had never told his daughter it still worked. Over 3 separate evenings, with a small recording device his retired colleague had provided, we captured conversations. Cecilia and my ex-husband discussing the medication adjustments, discussing the timeline, discussing what they would do with specific assets once guardianship was established. It took everything I had to sit on that and keep doing my job every morning like nothing had changed. The day Celia chose to make her move, she told me 2 days in advance. She mentioned it casually, like she was telling me about a grocery delivery. There would be a formal assessment meeting at the house on Friday. A neurologist, 2 psychologists, the family attorney, and several of father's longtime business partners. The goal was to demonstrate in front of witnesses that he was no longer capable of managing his own affairs. My ex-husband shook her hand in the hallway when she told him. He looked the way he used to look when he closed a deal. Relaxed, already thinking ahead to the next thing. Friday morning arrived cold and overcast, the kind of grey October sky that feels like it's pressing down on everything. People began arriving at 10. I stayed close to Mr. Whitfield. He was dressed carefully. A sport coat, pressed slacks, his silver hair combed back. He looked like what he was, a man who had built something significant and had not forgotten how. We went into the main sitting room together. The chairs were arranged around the large mahogany table. Cecilia sat at one end, composed, professional. My ex-husband sat to her left, a little behind her, the way a person sits when they believe they're about to watch something go exactly right. The neurologist opened the meeting and began explaining the assessment process. Cecilia interrupted gently to provide context, her father's history of episodes, the concerns of the medical team, what she described as a clear pattern of deterioration. She was smooth. I had to give her that. When she finished, she looked down the table at her father, and I watched her expression shift just slightly, just enough, because he wasn't looking back at her with confusion. He was looking at her with complete clarity. He said in a voice that carried easily to every person in the room, "I'd like to respond to that, if I may." Cecilia's mouth opened slightly. "Dad, I have been documenting," he said, "for the past 8 weeks a deliberate and coordinated effort to alter my medications without my knowledge or consent in a manner designed to impair my cognitive function and create the appearance of mental decline." He paused. "The purpose of this effort was to facilitate a legal guardianship that would transfer control of my estate to my daughter and her partner." The room was very quiet. The attorney, the one from Atlanta, the one we had hired quietly, stood up at the far end of the table and placed a folder in front of each person seated there. "We have the pharmacological analysis of the medication irregularities, signed by 2 independent specialists," he said. "We have financial records showing preparatory transfers of certain liquid assets consistent with anticipated inheritance, and we have recorded conversations." My ex-husband had gone very still. Cecilia said, "That's not," and then stopped. One of the business partners, a man who had known Mr. Whitfield for 30 years, picked up the folder and opened it. He read for about 15 seconds. Then he set it down and looked at Cecilia with an expression that I don't have a good word for. The neurologist said carefully that she believed it would be appropriate to pause the assessment pending a review of the information presented. Cecilia looked at her father. Whatever she was hoping to see on his face, she didn't find it. My ex-husband pushed back his chair. He said very quietly that he needed some air. One of the two law enforcement officers who had been waiting in the foyer, at the request of Mr. Whitfield's attorney, stepped into the doorway. "Sir," the officer said, "we'd ask you to remain seated." The color left my ex-husband's face so fast it was almost interesting to watch. What happened after that was loud and then very orderly, the way those things tend to go. Cecilia kept saying it was a misunderstanding while her hand shook. My ex-husband said almost nothing. They were both escorted from the property. The business partners sat around the table for a long time after they left, talking in low voices, and the Atlanta attorney made phone calls in the hallway. I stayed near the door out of the way. Eventually, the room cleared until it was just Mr. Whitfield and me. He was sitting very straight in his chair, both hands flat on the table, looking at the window. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You could have left. Plenty of people would have." "I needed a job," I said, which was true. "That's why you stayed at the beginning," he said. "That's not why you stayed at the end." I didn't say anything to that. He was right, and we both knew it. He looked at me then, directly, the way he had started doing once his mind had cleared, the way that told you he was thinking precisely and not around the edges. "I've been thinking about what comes next," he said, "for the estate, for the company." He folded his hands. "I've spent a considerable amount of time in the past 2 months thinking about who I want involved in decisions that matter to me." "Mr. Whitfield." "Let me finish." He said it gently. "I am not a sentimental man. I have been described by people who knew me well as practical to a fault. So when I tell you that I intend to establish a formal trust and that I want you named as a co-trustee with independent oversight authority, I want you to understand that it is not sentiment talking." I stared at him. "You are organized," he said. "You are discreet. You are not impressed by money, which is rarer than you'd think, and you make decisions based on what is actually happening rather than what you'd prefer to be happening." He paused. "Those are the qualities I spent 40 years trying to find in the people around me." I didn't know what to say. I sat with it for a moment. Then I thought about Maisie, about my mother's house, about a specific Sunday evening drive when Maisie had fallen asleep in the back seat, and I had cried the whole way home because I didn't know how I was going to pay October's rent. "I'll need to bring my daughter with me," I said. "If I'm going to be here more, I wouldn't do this long distance. She's 8. She needs her mom around." He looked at me for a moment. Then something softened in his face, just at the edges, just a little. "There are 6 bedrooms in this house," he said, "and 5 of them have been empty since my wife died. I think we can manage." On a Saturday morning in late November, I drove down to my mother's house in Decatur, and I packed Maisie's things into the car. She asked me about 100 questions on the drive north, the way she does, her legs swinging in the back seat because she's still just small enough that her feet don't reach the floor. When they pulled up the long driveway and she saw the house, she pressed her face against the car window and said, "Mom, is that a castle?" "No," I said. "It's just a very old house." "Can I have the room with the blue curtains?" I laughed, actually laughed for the first time in longer than I could remember. I thought about where I had been a year before, the course sheets, the emptied account, the 17 job applications, and the 2 callbacks, the listing that said most candidates don't make it through the first week. I thought about how the worst year of my life had led me to exactly the right place at exactly the right moment when someone needed another person to simply tell the truth. Sometimes that's all it takes. Not bravery, not money, not the right last name. Just someone who shows up every morning and refuses to leave. I still think about the moment I stood in that kitchen at 11 o'clock at night holding a glass of water, listening to a laugh I used to fall asleep to. There's a version of that night where I went back upstairs, packed my bag, and drove home in the dark. I think about that version sometimes. It would have made sense. It would have made sense. Nobody would have blamed me for not being able to stay in the same house as the man who had emptied our joint account and moved in with someone else 3 weeks after I signed the divorce papers. But Maisie's backpack was hanging by the door of my mother's house, 40 minutes south, with the little fox patch and the sunflower and the one that said, "Stay curious." And I had a daughter who needed school lunches and new shoes and a mother who wasn't going to fall apart. So I went back upstairs and I showed up the next morning. And the morning after that, what I've come to believe, not from any book, not from anyone telling me how to feel about it, just from living through it, is that how you act when things are genuinely hard is the thing that determines what comes next. Not luck, not who you know, not whether the universe is paying attention, just the accumulated weight of small choices made when nobody was watching and nothing felt worth it. Mr. Whitfield asked me once why I had told him the truth about what I'd overheard instead of staying quiet and keeping my job safe. The honest answer is that I didn't think about it strategically. I just knew that a man was being harmed, and I was the only person in that house who was going to say something about it. It wasn't brave in the way that people make bravery sound, loud and certain. It was quiet and a little terrifying, and I wasn't sure it was going to work. But that's what I've learned about integrity. It doesn't usually feel heroic in the moment. It mostly just feels like the only thing you can live with afterward. And the clear headedness it took, learning his patterns, understanding what was actually happening versus what everyone wanted me to believe was happening, finding the right doctor and the right attorney, and figuring out how to move quietly without tipping anyone off. That wasn't something I was trained for. It was just paying attention, watching carefully, trusting what I was actually seeing instead of what I was being told to see. That kind of thinking, I found, is a muscle. It gets stronger every time you use it instead of looking away. The hardest part was the endurance of it. 2 months of showing up every single day knowing what I knew, watching him perform confusion for his daughter's benefit, keeping my face neutral when my ex-husband talked about redecorating rooms that didn't belong to him yet. Some mornings I sat in my car for 5 minutes before going inside just to remind myself why I was still there. That discipline, choosing the longer, harder road because it's the right one, not because it feels good, is the only reason anything changed. I drove home with Maisie on a Saturday in November, and she asked me if it was a castle. I laughed in a way I hadn't laughed in months. That laugh came from somewhere real, somewhere that had been very quiet for a long time. What changed my life wasn't the outcome. It was the decision, made 100 small times in a row, to keep being someone I could recognize in the mirror,